Hey, it's Lou, and some wild shit is going down in Romania. A few weeks ago, thousands of expats returned to the country to lead an anti-government protest. Some demonstrators threw rocks, bottles, and smoke bombs at riot police, who responded with tear gas and water cannons. 450 people were injured. At issue was a controversial set of legislative changes that can make it more difficult to punish politicians for corruption. Obviously, the changes were written and approved by politicians, so definitely pretty sketchy. But Romania's been on an anti-corruption kick for more than a decade. Thousands of the country's elite have been jailed, and there are concerns that a parallel state is picking off political rivals one by one. So, is Romania in the middle of a reform movement or a witch hunt? Following World War II, the Soviets took control of Romania, a country that had spent the majority of the war aligned with the Axis powers. The Soviets exacted revenge by demanding reparations and draining Romania of resources, particularly oil. In the 1960s, a brutal communist dictator began a repressive regime in Romania that lasted for nearly a quarter of a century. His secret police terrorized the population, human rights were abused, poverty and hunger were widespread, and, not surprisingly, corruption flourished. Laura Stefan, a former director at the Romanian Ministry of Justice, told me this was a period of nothingness. There was literally nothing to buy in stores, so people created their own informal networks where bribes and secrets were traded for basic necessities like food and milk. The communists have been gone for nearly 30 years now, but the corruption has persisted among the powerful and the pedestrian. Stefan said corruption is simply part of Romania's social fabric, a day-to-day reality. Patrick Basham, director of the Democracy Institute, told me you might have to bribe a doctor's receptionist to get an appointment or give a kickback to a potential employer to land a job. Of course, there's the more high-level stuff, too. A government that hands out valuable contracts to friends and runs a patronage system that trades jobs for loyalty. The government has its tentacles in both private and public enterprise. A 2016 study estimated that if Romania reduced its corruption to normal EU levels, it would save somewhere between $16.2 and $33.4 billion a year. That number is stunning, but Romania has actually been improving on the corruption front. As part of its successful effort to join NATO and the European Union in the mid-2000s, the country launched an anti-corruption campaign. In particular, the National Anti-Corruption Directorate, DNA for short, was charged with cleaning up the country's shady institutions. It went into overdrive in 2013 when a prosecutor named Kovesi took control. Since then, about 1,200 people have been indicted on corruption charges every year. That includes senators, ministers, deputy ministers, and a member of European Parliament. This made the entrenched powers that be quite nervous. So early in 2017, the Parliament issued an emergency ordinance that effectively decriminalized a lot of low-level corruption. Romanians freaked out. The decree, enacted during a closed-door meeting held in the middle of the night, seemed to roll back all the anti-corruption momentum. Romanians' recent economic growth might be threatened by it. So people took to the streets. It was the largest demonstration in decades. After 6 days of public pressure, the decree was reversed. But the efforts to stop the anti-corruption movement was far from over. Earlier this year, Kovesi, largely perceived as a fearless badass who wouldn't back down from anyone, well, she got fired. Many Romanians felt her dismissal was politically motivated. She was threatening too many powerful people. It gets worse. In July, the Parliament passed a series of legislative changes that make it harder to prosecute corruption. Some of the measures seem tailor-made to benefit specific politicians awaiting trial. For instance, Liviu Dragnea, the leader of the Social Democratic Party, which controls Parliament, was found guilty in a fake job scandal in June. Apparently, he gave two party loyalists a salary from a state agency, even though they did no work there. But the controversial new rules require prosecutors to show the politician himself benefited from the abuse of power, so Dragnea might be able to get off. Now, the changes still await the president's signature, but Romanians aren't waiting around idly to see what happens. Earlier in August, thousands of Romanians living abroad came back to their home country to lead a protest and demand that the government be replaced. In fact, they projected the words, "Down with the government," on a government building. The ensuing police violence was seen as a symbol, especially in the West, of Romania's disturbing move towards repression and away from the recent reform efforts spearheaded by Kovesi and the DNA. Yet, putting aside the disturbing images from the protest, there is legitimate concern that the anti-corruption movement has become overzealous, perhaps even corrupt itself. Talk about irony. In June, Dragnea spoke to a crowd of 100,000 supporters and bemoaned, quote, "Absolutely everyone today in Romania can be targeted by a denunciation which could lead to an arrest or conviction." From that same stage, other politicians in his party criticized a deep state and a parallel state that was nefariously undermining Romania's elected leaders. Now, this rhetoric could be dismissed as a desperate attempt to explain away illegal behavior, but Basham told me at least some of the anti-corruption prosecutions in Romania have more to do with politics than crime. That is, prosecutions have become a way to settle scores. Basham said the trial of newspaper owner Dan Adamescu was particularly eyebrow-raising. Adamescu's newspaper was very critical of the Social Democratic Party. When a Social Democrat became president, Adamescu was targeted for investigation. He was convicted of bribery based on the uncorroborated testimony of a single witness.
My father is freely presumed to be guilty by the Prime Minister, by the government, by a lot of the media, and we see this reflected in the courtroom where he is not given a chance to defend himself properly.
Look, he may have been up to something no good, but the timing of the arrest and the political context is definitely suspicious. He eventually died in prison. There's a bunch of cases like this. A recent report written by a former special advisor to UK's Foreign Office explains, quote, "So many recent anti-corruption investigations involve the resurrection of old allegations from a decade ago or longer. The evidence has been saved up for the right moment." Basham also told me that Kovesi received so much adulation for her thousands of convictions that she naturally felt pressure to keep on delivering high-profile arrests. This may have led to her cutting some corners, and she seemed overly reliant on the SRI, the country's shadowy intelligence agency. Known for its aggressive and unwarranted wiretapping, the SRI has been accused of intimidating witnesses and judges. Whatever the reason, the DNA conviction rate is really high, above 90%. Those are the types of numbers you see in authoritarian China or Russia. The thing is, Stefan told me, Romanians are so cynical about their government that they assume everyone wealthy and well-connected is guilty of something and deserves the punishment. I, a cynic, appreciate this perspective, but it's definitely a dangerous mentality. Most justice systems the world over presume innocence. In Romania, critics of the anti-corruption movement think the opposite is in play, that you get labeled guilty even before the investigation begins. And that can lead to good people getting swept up in an overly aggressive dragnet. And the other thing to keep in mind, in a political culture in which everyone is a little corrupt, few will survive scrutiny. There'd be no one left to serve in government. That's why Basham suggests an amnesty period where everyone admits their faults and past crimes, and the country focuses on the future, not litigating its past. By the way, I'm not endorsing Kovesi's dismissal or the changes to the corruption law recently passed by Parliament. The latter, in particular, are pretty clearly egregious, self-dealing, undemocratic, and shameless. I mean, it's not a great look when politicians water down the laws used against them and their pals. But perhaps there's an equilibrium to be found, a balance between a popular anti-corruption unit chasing convictions and headlines at any cost, even if that cost is to due process, and a pessimistic system that tolerated corruption at every level. The problem with finding that balance, Stefan told me, is that the two sides aren't really listening to each other. Cynicism and distrust, two Soviet-era holdovers, have poisoned the proverbial well. I mean, when demonstrators are blasted with gas and water cannons, well, it's hard to have a dialogue in that environment.